Hello and welcome to this episode of Sansad TV, in which we will look at India's impressive contributions in UN peacekeeping operations worldwide. Since the UN began engaging in peacekeeping operations about 62 years ago, India became amongst the first countries to take part in these operations. And since then, India has provided nearly 250,000 peacekeepers in various UN peacekeeping operations worldwide. And even today, we have nearly 5,500 Indian peacekeepers in 8 out of the 13 missions that the UN is continuing to undertake for peacekeeping and for rebuilding societies across the world. In this, we must not forget the enormous contribution of Indian soldiers and the supreme sacrifice by about 175 Indian soldiers, many of them decorated with exceptional gallantry awards like the Paramveer Chakra, the Mahavir Chakra, the Veer Chakra, Sena Medal, and a whole host of other awards for their sacrifice and gallantry. And above all else, India also has continued to provide women policemen and medical support staff for peacekeeping operations. That has been welcomed and applauded across the world, giving India an edge over almost all other countries that take part in peacekeeping operations. And we will discuss in this show what it takes to be a country that sets the benchmark for the world in peacekeeping. And our two guests on this show are experienced hands at the United Nations in New York. And also we have with us General Monu Bhagat, who has been both a peacekeeping force commander and carried out a series of unique initiatives for India in Africa and Somalia, where he commanded a peacekeeping brigade, but later went on to become part of the UN's team as a military advisor on UN's military engagements, which are largely peacekeeping. And we have my good friend, Ambassador Manjeev Puri, who is a man of many parts, as some of you would have come to know by now, if you read his pieces regularly, and also the fact that he served as our Deputy Permanent Representative at the UN, but also had a shot at the Security Council. So, Ambassador Puri, I will start with you. Just explain to our viewers, how does the Security Council mechanism work when it comes to peacekeeping operation? Because the criticism of that has often been that it takes too long to come to a decision on whether or not to have a peacekeeping force. And by the time the decision is taken and a country is asked to put together a force and it's implemented, hundreds of thousands of lives are lost. The case of Rwanda is one case in point. Your views?
Maroof, you're very right. But international governance is about getting everybody on board. And that is not going to happen in a day or in a minute. What does the Security Council do? Very essentially, at least the 5 permanent members must be one. But there is international politics to play. You think things that happen in any country domestically, in any part of the world, are bereft of international politics? It's not the case. So they play the games, and games certainly get played. And only when things get out of hand and reported in their domestic media and becomes an issue of domestic concern that they tend to get together. So you're very right in your criticism. But this criticism is an inbuilt element of the way things are supposed to happen. Now, having said this, remember another thing. Peacekeeping has to be paid for. And invariably, the lion's share of the budget, there's a very elaborate process by which it is done, is picked up by those who have these heavyweight, let me say, voting rights at the UN. So there is the question of who pays, who gets it. There are various issues. But international politics, more than that, your interference with domestic politics plays a role in what you do. Once the sort of general kern is laid that, we will and we have to do something about getting in there, then let me tell you, matters at the Security Council proceed fairly fast a pace, and it doesn't take more than a few weeks to get a resolution ready. Of course, that's only the resolution, which means the legal framework allowing you to deploy peace. But peacekeeping is now a kind of settled institutional arrangement at the UN. There is a Department for Peacekeeping Operations, which then gets into the process of asking countries to volunteer troops. So the whole thing, I'm afraid, does take some amount of time, but that's in the nature of the way things are structured. Overall, let me make a point to you. Peacekeeping has been one of the sterling achievements of the United Nations. It faces a large number of criticisms on many areas otherwise. And I am happy to say that India has been the sterling part of this sterling achievement of the United Nations, because we as a country have not just done our part, but really lifted the heavy burden in terms of human and global good.
Well said. And General Saab, I would like to ask you that I think much of the credit of India's peacekeeping achievements goes to the Indian Armed Forces, both for the gallantry on the ground and the meticulousness with which they implement the operation. Now, just for educating our viewers, between the time Ambassador Puri has brought out that a decision is taken that, say, for instance, India will provide a contingent, quickly, point-wise, could you tell us the steps that are taken here? Because one thing I'm sure of, having served in the army, only the best and the most capable officers go for peacekeeping, and units that have had a good record. And I'm proud to say I served in 2 units. Both have done UN tenures and have received commendations. Your views?
Yes, you're right. There's a process of selection and choosing the best. And that's a major difference to many countries of the world and to us. I mean, people from our country and our neighborhood generally choose their best and send their best. So we are basically competing with our neighbors in performance. The others are far behind us. So what happens the moment there's a bugle sounded that they need to be setting up a mission somewhere in the world, which you get to know. I mean, people like him who are there in the permanent mission, they get the air of it. And there is for them to signal back home that your mission is likely to come up. And if you would like to participate, they get the feel. Then they say yes or no, as the UN asked them, because I worked on that part also in the UN as to how we form contingents and get them together. Yes, the process does take time, as he rightly brought out, because the UN doesn't have an army of its own. The political decision is not that of the UN. Depends on many factors. The resources, everything has to be pooled in and got. So that takes about 6 months to, well, can be even up to a year. Now, when we had to go to Somalia, I was picked up a year before we were to go. I was called to ready. We start with the commander always. And that's how what the UN should be doing. Start with the mission head, which they don't. This is one of the biggest reforms needed. The mission head and the force commander come in the last. And rest is done by people who won't be in field. So, and when you talk of reforms, unfortunately, the people who decide on reforms are diplomats who don't even have an inkling of what's happening in the ground. You know, they're far distant from reality. All the researchers, authors, various scholars, I've interviewed, so many have interviewed me, almost 13 TV channels when we were in Somalia, and I don't know how many scholars. I had to turn back some whom I saw later that they twisted my words. The BBC, I remember their rep came and I said to that lady, next time, no more. You go on and fool the world to what I had told you. I spent 3 hours talking to you because I tell them, if you have 3 hours, talk to me. Because you need to understand what peacekeeping is and not take a superficial knowledge and then go and write something.
Yeah, they're all in the business of keep it short and stupid. But Ambassador Saab, I want to understand from you, of late a new dimension seems to be emerging in peacekeeping. That is the role of non-military or non-soldierly activities, such as the role of women in policing. As the General was explaining to us in our conversation earlier, this does have a positive fallout also in terms of building societies, building infrastructures, police forces, medical services, and a whole lot of other things. So at the UN, is it spelt out to the concerned country that you will provide a brigade with a brigade commander with medical and other subunits also? Or you just say that we need a force there to sort the situation out? Because the identification of force numbers required is best done by a military man who is able to understand how the situation could extrapolate itself or how it could spill over into a manageable or an unmanageable problem.
Maroof, at the UN, there is a whole department staffed largely by military men, of course, internationally. And so the professionalism which goes into making these decisions, in my opinion, is pretty good.
Okay.
Coming now to the other issue. Look, the world has changed, hasn't it? When we spoke about peacekeeping and the way we sort of very traditionally look at it, it really means cease the violence by all means possible. And the last resort, the armed forces are being used. But that's not how the world actually has moved. There's been so much evolution in the last 30, 40 years. Can you just go in and fire randomly and do things? You can't. Those were the days when colonial Raj police, armies and so on went and pacified places. It's not about pacification. The buzzword today is actually peace building. And we've all had to accept this. Now, it is not for the peacekeeping force to do that per se. But willy-nilly, that becomes part and element of what you do. Doesn't the Indian Army also do that in the counterinsurgency operations?
Absolutely.
Hearts and minds has become the buzzword. Were we doing it 100 years back? Of course not. So these are the kinds of changes that have happened. And so, therefore, these roles are roles which have now become inherent to the mandate that you accept. Let me give you an example. There's a very big thing called protection of civilians, which in the last 20 years has become a paramount element. Otherwise, what was the idea? Stand between two warring factions, ensure that there is no violence, and well, the processes will take their own time or they won't. But now, the whole ideas are you need to move in and protect civilians. If there is an issue with civilians, that has become the paramount issue. In fact, for a long time, we felt that that would endanger our peacekeepers, which is true. Would you like, you put in your peacekeepers, in a sense, in a theory, that there is a kind of neutrality accepted by all the sides and that they won't be harmed. But if you go in for a, let me say, a proactive business of protection, then certainly there is every chance of harm coming your way. So many of these things have evolved. I think we need to move with the times. That's absolutely essential. And I'm very proud that the Indian armed forces and the Indian police units, the so-called formed police units that go, have done an exemplary piece of work wherever they've been deployed, moving with the times. And the credibility has come not just because they've been great soldiers, but because they've been great, not just peacekeepers, but also peace builders in the limited mandate that the peacekeeping operation needs to undertake.
In fact, that happily brings me to my next question, sir. You know, the very essence of training in the armed forces, particularly the army, which provides the bulk of the peacekeepers, is about preparing yourself for combat situations. From the training academies to training schools and courses, you know, from ek goli, ek dushman to various other things that you will be able to respond to an escalating situation because you have training and force and weapons. Now, in the UN situation, in a way, you are expecting the soldiers to exercise the utmost restraint despite the weapons they hold and not allowing the situation to becoming a firefight. My mind goes back to the work of Norman Dixon when he talks about the psychology of military incompetence, in which he says, you know, you would end up fighting somebody on a battlefront who you could have possibly been a friend with on another occasion. And you end up not fighting somebody who you might not befriend, whatever the circumstances. I'm paraphrasing. So how do you get the soldiers to transform from lethal fighting machines, because you pick the best and the most capable and the most Joshila soldiers to represent the national flag there. How do you put the lagam on them? How do you restrain them?
See, there's a part of, most of the military, most of the year is doing training. And training in various forms of war.
Yes.
As there are various variations of war.
Yes, sir.
Now, peacekeeping is also one kind of military activity, if not war. It's a military in a non-military role. Like what we say, you train in aid to civil authority. That's not a military war-like role, but that's aiding the civil authority for its governance or to bring things under control. Or let's say if there's a disaster, once again to manage things. Now, what is peacekeeping all about? It's nothing but aid to civil authority. So it's part of our basic training.
But what happens? There is no civil authority. If there's no civil authority that exists out there, what do you do then?
No. If there isn't, the people are there. So you have to manage people. Actually, people are the key factor in peacekeeping. Now, that depends on who you choose as a commander, how much he knows. I'll give you an example. I don't think it has happened before, it happened after. I don't think it's happened in any country of the world. Before I was chosen to lead the Indian Brigade to Somalia, the then chief, hats off to him, General Joshi, without my knowing, without anybody knowing, he had me sent to Pune to be screened by a psychologist and a psychiatrist. And I didn't know it either. And I met that lady on a breakfast meeting for 3 hours. She chatted with me normally, studying my personality. I mean, sorry, I have to cross the limits of being humble, but to bring out the point. And she said, why you're here? And who am I? I said, I don't know. You're Mrs. So-and-so. And all I know is I had a breakfast meeting with you. She told me, I'm a psychologist, I'm a psychiatrist. Your chief has sent you for me to see if I have the right person for it. I don't think it has happened ever in our army, before, after, or any country.
There are lots of good things that one hears about the late General Joshi.
Yeah.
And this is another
Oh, he's
one.
a great man, because I had direct dealings with him. So he was a general who had UN experience, who knew what UN requirements were. So he wanted a person who would understand the dynamics of a military person in a role which is non-military. And peacekeeping is a military in a non-military role. And why the military? Because military is the only one that is equipped, geared, trained, resourced, and disciplined to do things of the kind that are required in a very hostile situation and environment. All these things that they talk of protection of civilians, which the ambassador just mentioned, we had no training. We were the first to go. But from our mandate we derived what was our role. The Americans who failed found fault with the mandate. There's nothing wrong with the Security Council mandate ever. I maintain it till today as a very seasoned peacekeeper. I've seen many missions. And what happens, it was to provide a secure environment. Now, what does that mean? A secure environment means everything. Civilians, military, humanitarian agencies, UN aid agencies, everybody.
Point taken, sir. In fact, I want to ask Ambassador Puri that because he's dealt with the Yanks, I'm sure, on many an occasion at the UN and even otherwise. One of the questions I raised once to a gathering of Americans who were kind of on a self-congratulatory seminar about what they did in Mogadishu and all that stuff and elsewhere itself. I said, give me one example of a UN mission where American soldiers have served under a non-American commander. Secondly,
no.
Give me another example of a UN mission where American soldiers have gone in to fulfill a global UN mandate because you intend to pay for it in dollars, we pay for it with our blood. And it caught them completely on the back foot. And an American officer attending that from the Marine Corps actually got up in support of me and said, I'm ashamed to say I belong to a country of wimps, but that's another story. I want to ask you, Ambassador, that why is it that UN missions that are worked out after whatever deliberations at the UN, why is it that the Americans are not forthcoming to participate, or they create missions of their own and get the UN to just bless it? And the second thing is, what is the incentive? Certainly there are incentives for our soldiers, Pakistani soldiers and Bangladeshis, who I believe are the largest peacekeeping providers. What is the incentive for the Western countries to send in their soldiers for peacekeeping operations?
Maroof, you've raised a very large number of points. So the first point we must understand is that the decisions on international peacekeeping are international power play. Would you agree that the largest and more powerful countries will allow their soldiers to serve under others' commanders? I think we are living in a wishful world if we think so. So it's not just the Americans. Have the others allowed so? The Chinese have participated in hardly any peacekeeping operations. Now they are becoming some players. The British did something a long time back, took a beating and sort of walked out. The French keep doing these peacekeeping operations, but in a kind of manner which is, as you said, blessed by the UN, but in a sense which is independent. In Africa, there are a number of places where there are UN peacekeepers and French peacekeepers simultaneously, Mali being one of those cases, or there are many such examples. Now, this is the reality of life. This is the reality of the world. You said that we are sending our people because they are incentivized. If you don't mind, Maroof, I would like to disagree as far as India is concerned.
Okay.
And I would like that to be a defining feature of the future. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, I leave it to their countries. It's not for me to make comments on them. We used to be very happy with the few dollars that you used to get per soldier per day. Today, we are matching that dollar for the Indian soldier from the Indian exchequer. But that's not the reason. We chose to become a founding member of the UN peacekeeping business because we firmly believe that we owe it to the world, that when there is need, we are there in solidarity to step in. In the 60s, our abilities to provide, let's say, economic assistance was far limited. Here was something that we were capable of. And the world too, there's a cleansing of conscious issues, isn't it? That's how the first set of peacekeeping operations, and I'm leaving out Korea, which was a sort of ambulance mission, as they call it. Let's leave that out. Most of the operations in Africa are really a case of our colonial legacy and is falling to bits. People are being killed, being reported in our own newspapers, in the Western media. And you need to do some kind of conscious cleansing.
Not our, it's the Western.
Well, no, I'm talking about the West. Our being used in their sense of the term, not mine. And we were in a position to help. We took this challenge and have been doing it. So again, if you don't mind my saying so, I leave the word incentive out. You are reimbursed for some of the expenditures that you incur, which are huge. And in any case, no one is reimbursing you for the years of training, the equipment that you send, and so on and so forth. There's so many other elements to that. And I hope that in the future, this thought also won't occur to us.
Well, it's a clarification which is welcome because in my limited understanding of how the military men talk about UN operations, they don't jump at it because there are incentives involved, but certainly a UN mission is seen as a reward in many ways.
I do.
Both to reward your excellence as a unit and also to reward officers for years of excellence professionally, both in terms of exposure and the additional financial funding that comes with it. Now, there are different views. In the Pakistan Army, I'm given to understand, you get, as an officer, at least 2, maybe 3 missions abroad. In India, that's not the case. Maybe 1, maximum, you might be then absorbed in some other thing later on. But clearly, it is not just seen as another posting, if I may put it as bluntly as that. I don't know how the general would respond to that. But with that also, sir, I would like you to explain that clearly the men who go out and put their life on the line are not looking for any financial compensation because the price tag for volunteering to die cannot be compensated. So that is inherent in their nature. They will do the job to the best. And if it amounts to losing your life in the process, not a bad idea, if I may put it as subtly as that. But how would you look at this whole thing about you being identified to command a UN force, units being identified? What is the initial reaction to it? What is the message that goes out?
See, nobody in the Indian Army ever looks at a task from a monetary angle as to what are going to be the monetary benefits, and that's why, and neither does he have a choice. Even if he does, he's not going to be taken or be sent. So that is totally out. Not a single soldier of ours ever starts looking at the amount of dollars he would earn. Yeah, it's secondary. It does come. But that would happen even in your high altitude. If you get posted here, you get a high altitude allowance.
You can't compare that with a UN allowance.
You cannot. Certainly, I agree. But I'm just giving us a relative example, since whether it's an attraction or not. Yes, it does help. And I'll even quote here. I remember when all the Westerners left Somalia, I spoke to the Irish contingent commander. I said, why are you going? Don't you have an identity of your own? Why are you doing what the Americans are doing, the French are doing, the Belgians? Why? You are there under our safety net. You provide logistics to us. We will ensure your safety. Why don't you stay on? And we realized that they were capable of providing us the logistic support. And they did stay. And I remember when the chief visited them, he and the defense minister, they spoke to me very frankly. They said, first, we decided to stay because we don't have to ape others. The other was that, yes, we are happy that the UN is able to give us some extra money to give these soldiers, which we as a nation cannot. He was very forthright about it. And that benefit even happens in India. And why not? What is wrong
I'm
in
not
that?
grudging it for one
But
moment.
it's not that we look forward to that. No. We don't count our service there or devotion to duty there in terms of the dollars that we are getting in
No,
return.
I think I'm misunderstood, but let me just clarify. You don't aim for a UN assignment with a dollar check in mind, but certainly with it comes a kind of reward for the time you spent there, which if you compare with another operational posting in an insurgency
answer
or high
that.
altitude area, you're perhaps better
I was
rewarded.
coming to that. Definitely it's a very good exposure. You work with armies of the other countries. And I did realize there as an individual, and so did all my men, I'm sure, that they compared themselves to the capability of others and their own. They came back much more confident because they found they could do what even the Westerners could not do, whom they've heard of so much. The Americans, I remember when the Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff General Shelly Keshwali visited me in Somalia. He went around our brigade and he said, I'm going to go back and make the Americans do this. So I said,
I have read about the success of your brigade, including the fact that I think you had a Pakistani unit under you.
not Pakistani unit, they were there alongside a Pakistani brigade.
Okay.
And
Okay. And yes, I've seen an international television report on your brigade, which was very favorable, but we're completely
No,
out
what
of
I'm
time.
just trying to say that General Shelly actually took those lessons home and he tried exactly what we did, A to Z, in Haiti. He chose the commander, General Kinzer. I went visited Haiti when I was in the
We
UN.
need to wrap up. Sir.
Yeah. And I found that we had in service of humanity, he put on his quarter guard in service of peace. That was the only change.
Okay.
And rest, they borrowed everything from us.
Well, yeah, humanity is a difficult word for the Americans, but anyway, more of that.
No,
in the
but
next
how many
one.
Shell Keshwalis and
Thank
how
you
many
very much.
Kinzers?
Thank you very much for all your inputs. Hope one day we can have you again on a similar show, but until then, goodbye and thanks for watching.